The room is already full of light that does not belong to it, not lamplight, and not the gray before dawn that a sleeper might mistake for something else. This light comes from nowhere in the walls and from everywhere in the air at once, and it is the color of something no Theban word quite reaches. Not gold, not white, not the thin brightness of high summer. The walls themselves seem to have grown warm, as though the stone has been holding heat from a fire that lit this room many years before Semele was born. She is standing near the center of the room, because there is no longer a direction in the room that feels safer than any other, and the light is already past the point where closing her eyes would help. Zeus is there, not as she has known him, not in the shape of a mortal man, the form he wore when he first came to her, the form that allowed for conversation and for the kind of love that takes place between one person and another without catastrophe. He is there as what he is, and what he is does not fit inside a room. The light is not coming from him so much as it is him, extended outward through every surface, pressing against the walls from inside, finding no ceiling high enough, no floor sufficient to contain it. The air smells like a storm that has already passed the point of beginning. This is where the story finds its first footing. Here, in this Theban room, with a mortal woman standing in the center of it, and a god filling every remaining inch. Thebes was an old city when this story took shape. It sat in Boeotia, that wide and fertile region of central Greece, and it was already built from stories before Dionysus was ever connected to it. Cadmus founded it. Cadmus, the Phoenician king's son, who followed a white cow across the world and built his city where the cow lay down to rest. He was Semele's father, which made her a princess of a city that understood itself as standing at the intersection of divine and human business. Her grandfather was, in one line of the tradition, the god Ares. Her great-uncle, in another, was Poseidon. Thebes was not the kind of place where extraordinary things were unexpected. Exactly, and still this was extraordinary. The oath she had asked for was the kind of oath that cannot be refused. Sworn on the river Styx, the deep water beneath the world that even gods could not forswear without consequence, it bound Zeus to a promise made before he knew what would be promised. He would give her whatever she asked. That was the promise. And what she asked, standing in the room with him, having given this some thought, convinced by a voice in her ear that this was what she most desired, was to see him as he truly was, to see the god in his full form, undimmed, unmoderated, without the careful dimming that made him possible to be near. She wanted to see the real thing. What had brought her to this asking deserves its own quiet look. Hera had found her way to Thebes in the shape of an old woman, not an old woman in general, but specifically the shape of Beroe, who had been Semel's nurse, who had held her as a child, and spoken to her in the tone of someone whose care for her was long and genuine and reliable. Hera wore this shape as she moved through Thebes, stooped and unhurried, turning her head the way old women turn their heads, carefully, a little slower than younger people need to. She was not rushing. She had a particular word to place in Semele's ear, and she wanted to place it well, and she had time. The word, when it came, was a question. Had Semele really seen him as he was? Was she certain? And beneath the question, softly, the suggestion that certainty would be satisfying, that knowing, truly knowing, would be better than not knowing. Ovid records this conversation, and in his account, Hera does not force anything. She simply opens a door that was already there, and Semele, who was mortal and curious and in love with a god who had chosen to be near her, walked through it. This is one of those places in the tradition where what might be called cruelty and what might be called inevitability are sitting very close to each other, close enough that it is difficult to say clearly where one ends and the other begins. Hera had reasons. The tradition is consistent about this. She was the wife of Zeus, and the situation with Semele was not one that a wife who was also a queen and also a goddess could reasonably be expected to ignore. The calculation she performed was cold, but within the world the myth describes, it follows its own logic. Semele asked. Zeus, bound by the Styx, could not refuse. The light began. The tradition does not say it was painful, though it is clear enough from the shape of events that follows that no mortal frame could hold what filled that room. What it says in its various versions is that the fire came, the lightning that Zeus was, the actual substance of his divinity, the thing that drove the storms and moved through the sky in brilliant lines from cloud to ground. That thing was in the room, was every part of the room, and Semele was mortal, and mortal bodies do not persist inside that kind of presence. The walls held heat that no walls hold. The light had no ceiling, and then there was silence in Thebes, in that particular room, of a quality that was different from ordinary silence. But before the silence was complete, there was the infant. The child had not yet been born. The months of gestation were not finished, and what remained of them would need to be finished somewhere. This is the part of the story that requires the slowest attention, because it is strange even within a tradition that is already strange, and the strangeness is the point. Zeus, moving with whatever speed and care a god moving through catastrophe might bring to a very small and unfinished thing, drew the barely formed infant from the flames of what had been Semele's body. He drew the child out, and the child was alive, and he was not yet complete. Small, he was very small and unfinished in the way that things are unfinished when they have not yet been given the full time they require. If you tried to imagine what he looked like, what came back was something like a seed, not the plant, not the root system, and the spreading branches and the leaves that catch light, but the thing before all of that, the dense and curled potential of it, held in one hand. Zeus held something like that and looked at it and found a solution that no other story in the tradition quite anticipates. He opened his own thigh into the flesh of his own divine body, warm with the specific warmth that belongs to gods and not to anything else. He pressed the child and then closed the thigh around him and carried him. For the remaining months of what should have been gestation, Dionysus lived inside the body of his father, completed in that dark and warm interior, fed by whatever feeds the unborn, growing by whatever measure is used for gods who are becoming what they are going to be. The transformation of a divine body into a living vessel is a specific kind of image, not a metaphor. The tradition holds it as a literal account of what happened, that the god king of Olympus became, for some months, the container of another life, carrying it the way that only certain kinds of bodies usually carry. This is not an image the tradition apologizes for or explains away. It simply holds it, and it is worth holding alongside it without hurrying past. 5. Did not know what was happening in the sky. The city went on, as cities do, and Cadmus mourned what mourning required, and time passed in the way that time passes, even when extraordinary things are occurring in its current. The story had moved out of the city now, up into whatever altitude the divine business of Olympus occupies, and was completing itself there, in the interior of a god's body, without witnesses. When Dionysus emerged, it was a second birth. The tradition was clear on this, and it gave the event its own vocabulary. The first birth had been from Semele, from the mortal body of the Theban princess, begun in love and ended in fire. The second birth was from Zeus, from the thigh of the sky god, completed in warmth and closed flesh. Two births, two bodies, two origins, neither one quite complete without the other. The epithet that attached to Dionysus from this event, the name that the tradition reached for when it wanted to compress the whole strange story into a single sound, was dithyrambos. In the Greek, the word carried, among its several possible meanings, something like he of the double door, two entrances, two beginnings. The shape of the word itself was a kind of shorthand for the whole narrative, the mortal door of Semele's body, and the divine door of his father's thigh, and a god who had come through both of them and was therefore something neither parent alone could entirely account for. The ancient Greeks believed that the choral hymn called the dithyramb took its name directly from this birth. The dithyramb was a form of communal singing, performed by choruses of 50, devoted to Dionysus, and its name was thought to be an echo of the god's own epithet. The hymn named for the double birth, the music shaped around the fact of two origins, 50 voices in a circle, moving through a torchlit space, and the sound they made was understood to be carrying something forward. Not just melody, the word itself, the name that held the story. Dithyrambos, repeated in breath and rhythm, passed from voice to voice across the years. There is something in that transmission that the tradition seems to want to honor. The idea that the unusual facts of a god's beginning could become the foundation of an artistic form, could turn into music, could travel in that shape through centuries with the double origin still inside it. Every chorus that sang the dithyramb was, in some sense, singing the birth. Every time the word was formed in a mouth, the story it held was moved a little further along. Hera had not been present for the second birth. She was present in her calculating way for the first, or rather for the conversation with Semele that made the first birth necessary in the form it took. But the second birth was Zeus's alone, and what emerged from it was a child whose very existence was a kind of answer to the attempt to prevent it. The god who came through two doors was not diminished by the loss of his mother or by the fire that had closed one of those doors. He was, if anything, constituted by it, built from the exact shape of what had been survived. The city of Thebes down in Boeotia did not yet know what it had begun. Cadmus's city, the city built where the white cow lay down, founded on a myth already carrying the particular weight of a place that had been chosen, would encounter the god again. Euripides, centuries later, would bring Dionysus back to exactly this city for his most articulate and devastating examination of what happens when a god is refused. But that is the city's later business. For now, in the early part of the story, Thebes was simply the place where it had started. And what had started, specifically, was a god with two births and two names, and an origin that no single city could contain, carried forward first in divine flesh, and then in sound, in the choral form that bore his epithet, in the 50-voiced song that moved through Greek religious life for centuries, and carried inside it the strange fact of the thigh and the fire. Consider for a moment the shape of the story so far. A mortal woman in a room, a god who fills every inch of it, an oath sworn on the river beneath the world that cannot be unsworn, a nurse-shaped queen speaking quietly in a shaded courtyard, fire. And then, out of the fire, something so small and new that it fits in a god's hand, pressed into the warmth of a divine body, growing in the dark of that interior toward whatever it was going to become. Each of these moments is ordinary in scale. A conversation in a courtyard, a room filling with light, a hand holding something small and extraordinary in consequence, which is a quality the tradition seems to find important. The divine does not arrive in this story as something that sweeps the human world away without touching it first. It enters through a room, through a nurse's voice, through a hand that reaches into flames for something that needs finishing. The courtyard where Hera spoke, the particular shaded courtyard of a Theban house, somewhere inside the city Cadmus built, is worth pausing in for a moment. Hera wore the shape of an old woman with complete attention to detail. The stooped posture, the careful movement of the head, the voice of someone who had known Semele from infancy, who had held her and spoken to her, and therefore knew which register to use. She was not performing the old nurse. She was the old nurse perfectly, for as long as the conversation required. And the conversation was short. Just a question, really, with a suggestion underneath it, placed with a calm and unhurried precision that suggests a person who has given the matter considerable thought. Semele listened to the nurse she trusted and decided that certainty would be satisfying. This is not a portrait of stupidity or gullibility. It is a portrait of someone making a very human decision that knowing the full truth of something is better than knowing only part of it, that the person you love should be available to you as they actually are, not in a form modified for your protection. The request she made was coherent. It simply was not survivable. Zeus, standing in the ordinary room of a mortal house, the air already beginning to change, was already past the point of intervention. The oath bound him. The Styx, deep beneath everything, held the promise in place. What he was about to do, he could not refuse to do, and what the doing would mean for the room and the woman in it was known to him before it happened. The tradition does not explore at length what this knowledge was like to hold. It moves forward, as myths tend to do, through the event to what followed it, because what followed it is the point. The infant drawn from the flames is the point. The thigh is the point. The double birth, and the name that the double birth produced, and the hymn that the name produced, that is the point. Semele's death, in this telling, is the hinge that the door swings on, and what the door opens to is the story of a god. This is one of the qualities that distinguishes this particular divine birth from more straightforward accounts of the same kind. The mother's death is not incidental to the story. It is the mechanism by which the story becomes what it is. If Semele had lived, if the light had been somehow diminished enough, if the oath had not been sworn, there would be no second birth, there would be no thigh, there would be no dithyrambos. The loss is in the structure of the myth, also the origin. The fire that ends one thing is the condition for the other thing to begin. The ancient Greeks who told this story and sang the dithyramb in honor of the god were not, on the whole, treating it as a tragedy. They were treating it as an account of how a particular god came to exist, and the god they were describing was one whose worshippers found him joyful, generative, overwhelming in the best sense, the god of what flows and ferments and breaks down the distance between one person and another. The circumstances of his birth were unusual. The god who emerged from them was real and present and important. The tradition held both facts simultaneously without finding them contradictory. The city of Thebes was built on a founding myth of its own, Cadmus killing a dragon and sowing its teeth in the earth, from which armed men sprang, who fought each other until only 5 remained, and those 5 became the founding families of the city. A city that began in dragon's teeth and warriors grown from the ground was already the kind of place where divine proximity was part of the landscape. Semele was born into that story, the daughter of the man who had sown the teeth and built the walls and given the city its name and its first generation of citizens. She was also the daughter of Harmonia, who was herself the daughter of Ares and Aphrodite, which made Semele the granddaughter of both war and love, which is, in retrospect, not an unpredictive lineage for someone whose life ends in divine fire and whose son becomes the god of ecstasy. The tradition is sometimes like that, the ancestry pointing, quietly, toward the thing that will happen. What Cadmus built in Boeotia was real to the tradition in a specific way. The city had walls, and a royal family, and a founding myth, and a particular relationship with the divine that set it apart from other Greek cities. And the story of Dionysus's conception was anchored there, in those specific streets and houses, in the lineage of that specific family. The god did not begin somewhere abstract. He began in a room in Thebes, in the household of Cadmus, with an oath and a fire, and a very small life held in a god's hand. The room is quiet now. The light has gone. What remains is the city outside, its ordinary life, its walls, its founding myth, its streets, and the story of what happened in that room moving forward into the world, away from Thebes, carried in the epithet, and the hymn, and the name, Dithyrembos, 2 doors, 2 beginnings. The word sits in the mouth with a particular weight, the dithix at the front of it, the venephrembos at the back, the whole thing carrying something that individual syllables don't quite contain alone. When 50 voices sang it in a circle, the sound went around and around the torchlit space and did not stop at the edges of the space. It moved out into the air beyond it, carried further each time a new chorus took it up, from one city to another, from one generation to the next. The hymn named for a birth, the birth that required 2 bodies, the 2 bodies that between them held, for the duration of a gestation completed, under unusual circumstances, the god who would eventually fill the ancient world with the smell of pressed fruit and the sound of strings and the particular pleasure of finding at the end of a very long road something worth drinking. But that is the road ahead. What matters here, at the beginning, is the origin, the specific, improbable, carefully structured origin of a god whose name was also a record of how he arrived. A goddess walking stooped through Thebes, a princess standing in a room that had already begun to fill with something too large for its walls, a fire, and out of the fire, small and unfinished and alive, the thing that would become Dionysus, pressed into the warmth of a divine body, and carried forward in the dark toward a second birth that would give him his name, Dithyrambos, he of the double door. The word itself is old, older than the texts that record it, older than the choruses that sang it, old in the way that origins are old, because the thing it names was by definition there before the name, and the name came into the world trying to describe something that had already happened in a room in Thebes, in the particular silence that followed a particular light. There is something worth sitting quietly with in the fact that a god's epithet could carry this much. Not just a title, not just a label attached for convenience, but a word that held the whole shape of an unusual beginning compressed into its syllables. To say Dithyrambos was to say the fire, and the thigh, and the months of gestation completed inside a divine body, and the moment of the second birth, and the particular nature of a god who had come through all of that, and was therefore something that did not fit neatly into any single category. Mortal mother, divine father, 2 births, 1 god. The tradition carried this word for centuries, through the choral form that bore the same name, through the religious festivals, where 50-voiced groups moved in circles and sang of what the word contained. And somewhere underneath the singing, underneath the formal occasion of the festival, there was always the original room, small, warm, already filling with something that no room was built to hold, and a woman standing in the center of it, and a god who was everything the walls could not contain. That room is the beginning of a very long story, and the story, as stories of this kind tend to do, would not stay inside the city's walls. What Cadmus built endured, and what happened inside it endured in the form of the telling, passed forward in the word that carried both births, the word that choral voices shaped into music, the word that meant a god had come through a fire and a thigh and arrived in the world with a name that was also an account of the journey. This is one of the things ancient traditions do with their most unusual stories. They find the word, or the name, or the form that can carry the whole strange weight of it without dropping anything, and they hand that form to the next generation and ask them to carry it further. The chorus of 50 voices moving in a circle, the torchlight rising and falling around them, the sound of the word in 50 mouths at once, the finer's rambos falling at the end of each repetition, landing in the space the way words land when they carry something heavier than words usually carry. Definer bows. The sound of a god's double birth, moving in breath and rhythm across centuries, still carrying the fire and the thigh and the small unfinished life that a divine hand drew out of the flames and pressed, with care, into the warmth of its own body. On a hillside in the ancient East, where the air holds warmth long after the sun has moved past the highest point of the sky, the grapevines grow in their slow and particular way. Their roots go down into dry, rocky soil. Their leaves, broad and deeply lobed, turn on their stems to catch whatever light reaches them through the tangle of the canopy. And on those branches, heavy and dark and beginning to split, where the skin has grown tighter than the fruit inside can bear, the grapes hang in full clusters, unpicked, waiting. It was here, according to the tradition, that a divine hand reached among the leaves and pressed a thumb into the skin of the fruit. What ran out was dark and sweet and still warm from the sun. The god tasted it, and then, the story holds, he began to think about what else the fruit could become. Diodorus Siculus, the Greek historian writing in the 1st century before the Common Era, describes Dionysus as the god who first worked out the process by which grapes could be pressed and sealed and left to undergo their slow internal change. The fermentation of grape juice into wine was, in the ancient Greek understanding of the world, not an agricultural discovery made by many people in many places over time, but a single divine act of knowledge. Dionysus did not merely find the vine. He understood it. He understood what the fruit wanted to do if it was given the right conditions, warmth, time, darkness, and the sealed vessel, and he let it do that thing, and then he tasted the result. The substance that emerged from that process was understood to be something entirely new in the world. Not grape juice, not water, something that had no name yet, because nothing like it had existed before. Ancient Greek art returned to this identification between Dionysus and the vine across many centuries of representation. On painted ceramic vessels from the 6th century forward, the god appears with grape clusters at his shoulders, with vine leaves twining through the dark curls of his hair, with a cup in one hand whose contents are understood without needing to be described. The Montor them bulb image recurs on cups, on storage vessels, on the walls of drinking rooms, on the sides of large mixing bowls meant to hold wine diluted with water at a gathering. The god and the vine were so consistently identified that to see the vine leaves was already to see the god. Many of the ancient sources place the earliest mythological phase of this discovery, not in Greece but further east, the region of Phrygia, the hills of Lydia, the broader stretch of Near Eastern landscape where warm conditions and fertile hillside soil made the grapevine something that already grew in abundance. These were the places where, in the ancient Greek understanding, the god first developed his knowledge of the vine and its fruit. This Eastern origin was not incidental to the story. It aligned with something the Greeks themselves recognized, which is that viticulture did not originate in the Aegean. The knowledge of the vine and the practice of winemaking arrived in Greece from somewhere else, carried along the same trading and migration routes that carried other forms of knowledge westward. When the myth described Dionysus beginning his work in the East and carrying that work slowly toward Greece, it was preserving, in its own terms, something that was historically true, that wine had come from elsewhere, that it had traveled a long distance before it arrived. The hillsides of Phrygia, in the mythological imagination, were the place where this began. The specific landscape matters here. These were not the bright limestone hills of the Greek mainland, but a different kind of country, warmer, more densely vegetated in the river valleys, with a richness in the soil that encouraged growth of a particular kind. The grapevine that grew there had been growing for a very long time. It did not need to be planted. It grew along the edges of clearings and wound itself into the branches of trees at the margin of the forest. What Dionysus brought to it was not cultivation in the agricultural sense, not yet. What he brought was attention. The sustained, careful, genuinely curious attention of a divine mind applied to a particular plant and its particular properties. Fermentation is a patient process. It does not happen quickly, and it does not announce itself. A vessel of pressed grape juice sealed in the dark does nothing visible for a long while. The change happening inside it is entirely internal, a slow chemical transformation in which sugars become something else, in which the character of the liquid shifts beneath a surface that looks quiet. What emerges from that vessel days or weeks later is fundamentally different from what went in. The ancient Greeks understood this transformation as something more than a biological process. The fact that the fruit, left in the right conditions, would change itself into a substance capable of altering the mind of the person who drank it. This seemed to the Greeks to require explanation of a kind that chemistry alone could not provide. If grape juice could become something that made mortal minds approach divine experience, then the vine was not an ordinary plant. And if Dionysus had understood this about it before anyone else did, then the god was not merely associated with wine, he was inside it. This is the understanding that shaped Greek religious thought about wine for centuries. The intoxicating properties of wine were not understood as a physiological effect that happened to occur when fermented grape juice entered the bloodstream. They were understood as the presence of the god himself, temporarily perceptible in the experience of the drinker. To drink wine in honor of Dionysus was to take the god into the body, not metaphorically. In the genuine religious understanding of the Greek world, the cup of wine at a gathering where the god was honored was a point of contact between mortal and divine consciousness, a moment at which the usual firm boundary between what a human being could perceive and what the gods experienced became, briefly, permeable. This is what made wine different from other agricultural products in Greek thought. Grain was a gift from Demeter, and it was understood as nourishment, sacred in its own way, but connected to sustaining the body rather than to dissolving its ordinary constraints. Wine did something else. Wine, as the Greeks understood it, temporarily unmade the ordinary conditions of human perception. It loosened the rigid structures of sober consciousness and allowed something else, something less organized and more expansive, to move through in their place. The drinking of wine, properly conducted, with appropriate libations and the right ritual attention, was a form of religious practice in itself, a participation in the god's nature that was understood to be genuine and serious, not decorative. The Greek symposium, the formal drinking gathering at which wine was mixed and shared among a group of men, was organized around this understanding without always articulating it in explicitly religious terms. The crater, the large mixing vessel in which wine was diluted with water before being served, stood at the center of the gathering. The amount of water added to the wine was a matter of custom and conversation. The deliberate mixing of water with wine was itself a civilizing act, a way of mediating between the raw divine presence in the undiluted liquid and the ordinary human gathering in which it was being shared. Wine drunk unmixed in the Greek understanding was dangerous. It carried too much of the god's unmediated presence for ordinary use. The ritual of the symposium was, in part, a way of receiving the god at a manageable intensity. From the east, the tradition holds, Dionysus carried his knowledge westward. The region of Thrace, which occupied the northern edge of the Aegean world, and was understood by the Greeks as a transitional territory between the known world and the more exotic East, appears repeatedly in Dionysiac mythology as a place the god passed through on his way toward Greece. Thrace had its own wine culture, its own established relationships with the vine, and in the mythological tradition, this gave the region a particular character. It was a place already attuned to the god's presence, already partly prepared for what he brought, but also a place where the god encountered some of his earliest resistance. The paradox of Dionysiac mythology is that the god who brought wine to the world also encountered, at nearly every stage of his journey, mortal rulers who did not want what he was offering. The vine moved with him, not literally, though the mythological imagination sometimes described it that way. Grapevines sprouting along the path the god had walked, taking root in soil that had been dry before his passing. The knowledge moved with him. The understanding of what the fruit could become, what it was for, how it should be treated and prepared and offered, traveled from east to west in the god's company. But knowledge of this kind does not travel without complication. The story of Icarius demonstrates this clearly, in the specific and slightly melancholy way that myths demonstrate things. Icarius was a man of Attica, a mortal who encountered Dionysus in the early period of the god's arrival in the region, before wine had become familiar to the people who lived there. The god was generous with him. He shared the knowledge of winemaking directly with Icarius, teaching him the art that had begun on those eastern hillsides and traveled all this way westward. Icarius received the gift without reservation. He was, in the story, exactly what the myth imagines as the ideal recipient of divine knowledge: open, grateful, immediately moved to share what he had been given with the people around him. He went to the shepherds on the hills of Attica with the wine he had made. He offered it to them freely, and the shepherds drank. And this was the first time in the story that people who were not the god himself had tasted the substance that Dionysus had made from the eastern hillside grapes. The shepherds felt something shift in the way the light arrived. The sky seemed to tilt very slightly above them. The ordinary proportions of the afternoon changed in ways they had no language for, because no language yet existed for what they were experiencing. They had never been intoxicated before. They had no framework for understanding what was happening to their perception, and no way of knowing that the experience would pass and leave them unchanged. No reason to understand the sensation as anything other than what it felt like from inside, which was, to a mind that had never felt this way before, something very much like being slowly poisoned. The shepherds killed Ascarius. The tradition preserves this plainly, without dwelling in it. They buried his body in a field, and they went home. His daughter Aragon, who is named in the ancient accounts alongside her dog Myera, could not find her father. Myera went ahead of her, moving across the fields with the particular single-mindedness of an animal following a scent, circling back to one patch of disturbed earth on a hillside until Aragon understood what the circling meant. She found where he was buried. The tradition records her grief, and then it records her death. She hanged herself near where her father had been buried, overcome by what she had found. This is a story the ancient Athenians told about why they performed certain rituals. The death of Icarius and the grief of Aragone were understood to have required a ritual response, and the response was built into the Athenian religious calendar. There were festivals associated with the events of the story, and the sky, in the ancient mapping of the heavens, was said to carry traces of what had happened. Aragone, in the constellation Virgo, her father, or the figure of the morning man in the stars of Bootes, the faithful dog Myera in the star Procyon. The tradition had a way of taking its most difficult stories and finding a place for them in the larger structure of the world, so that nothing was simply lost. The story of Icarius is not primarily a story about violence. It is a story about the difficulty of introducing something genuinely new into a world that has no category for it yet. The shepherds were not cruel. They were frightened and bewildered, and they acted from within that bewilderment. The gift that Icarius received from Dionysus was real and generously given. The problem was not the gift. The problem was the gap between what Icarius understood the gift to be and what the shepherds, with no prior experience of its effects, were able to understand about it when it arrived in their cups. This gap between the knowledge of what wine is and the experience of encountering it for the first time without that knowledge is the condition the myth is examining, and the examination takes the form of a death because that is how myths record the weight of the things they are thinking about. The image of Icarius that remains after the story has been told is the image of a man on a hillside with a skin of wine in his hands, genuinely trying to give something good to people who are not ready to receive it. There is a kind of patience required to understand what you are receiving, and that patience takes time to develop. Wine in the Greek world took time to become familiar. It became the center of a complex and highly organized set of practices, precisely because those practices were the accumulated response to all of the bewilderment and misunderstanding that came with encountering it for the first time. The ancient Greeks depicted Dionysus on painted vessels in ways that circulated far beyond the places where those vessels were made. A painted cup or storage jar could be loaded onto a trading ship in the Athenian port of Piraeus and arrive weeks later in a harbor on the coast of Spain or on the shores of the Black Sea. The god traveled in this way too, not only in the mythology of his wandering, but in the images fired into the clay that carried his face and his vine leaves and his grape clusters from one coast to another. In harbors where no one had yet heard his name, his image arrived first, carried in the hold of a ship among oil and grain. The painted Dionysus appeared with vine leaves clustered at his shoulders, a cup in one hand, his expression in the archaic painted style, calm and slightly remote, the expression of someone who has been doing something for a very long time and knows its outcome. The tradition held that Dionysus understood his gift in terms far larger than agriculture. Wine was not, for the god who had discovered it, a product. It was a relationship. The relationship between the mortal drinker and the divine presence that the wine carried was the thing the god was interested in, the thing that made the vine worth all the attention he had given it. The specific pleasure of ripened fruit was a starting point. The transformation of that fruit into something that could temporarily alter mortal consciousness was the discovery. But what the discovery was for, the religious dimension of it, the way it could be made into a point of genuine contact between human and divine experience, this was the knowledge that the god had developed and was carrying westward. The vine itself is a patient plant. It does not grow quickly. It takes years before a newly planted vine produces fruit worth harvesting, and the oldest vines, the ones whose trunks have thickened over decades until the wood has gone almost to stone, produce the most complex fruit. A grapevine will grow in soil that would defeat most other plants. Its roots go very deep in search of water, deeper than the roots of most cultivated things, and they find what they need in dry and rocky conditions that seem, from the surface, inhospitable to growth. This quality of the vine, its capacity to persist and produce in conditions of difficulty, was noticed by the Greeks and felt to be connected to the character of the god who had discovered it. Dionysus was not a god of easy abundance. The gifts of Demeter were abundant in a straightforward way. Grain grew in good soil, in good weather, and the harvest was visible and proportional to the care given. The vine was more complicated than that. It required patience. It required the willingness to wait years before something useful emerged. And what it eventually produced was not simply nourishment, but a substance whose effects were unpredictable, whose relationship to the person receiving it depended on how that person encountered it. A gathering at which wine was shared was always, in the Greek understanding, something that required management. The ritual of mixing the wine with water was not merely practical, not simply a way of making a strong substance gentler. It was a way of acknowledging that what was in the crater needed to be treated with a kind of considered attention. The symposium had rules about how much to drink, about who served, about how the conversation was conducted, about what topics were appropriate at different stages of the evening as the wine gradually deepened the atmosphere of the room. These rules were not restrictions on the god's presence. They were the structure that allowed his presence to be received in a useful way. Undiluted wine, in the Greek world, was something to be careful of. It was understood to carry the god's presence at a concentration that ordinary human consciousness was not well suited to sustaining for long. There were stories of people driven to excess by drinking unmixed wine, of the particular madness that could arrive when the god's influence was received without the mediating ritual that the symposium provided. The measured ceremony of the gathering, the libations poured first, the formal acknowledgement of the god before anyone drank, the dilution in the crater was the Greek solution to the fundamental challenge that wine had always posed, which is the challenge that the story of Icarius describes. The substance was powerful. The question was always how to receive that power without being undone by it. The eastern hillside where the vine first came under the god's attention was a long way in the Greek imagination from the formal Athenian drinking room, but the distance was also the story of how the gift was refined. What Dionysus had found in Phrygia was raw, the dark fruit, the sweet liquid, the possibility of fermentation, the first taste of what the process could produce. What arrived in Athens centuries later was not raw at all. It was wine that had been thought about carefully, surrounded by ritual and ceremony, and the accumulated wisdom of many generations who had been working out how to receive what the god had given. The painted cups showed a serene and vine-wreathed god, and that serenity was the image of something domesticated, not tamed, not diminished, but brought into a form that a mortal community could live with. The fermentation vessel is worth returning to because the ancient Greeks found it genuinely interesting in itself. The specific process that happens inside a sealed container of grape juice, the slow, invisible transformation in which the liquid changes its character entirely without any visible action being performed on it from outside, had the quality of a small contained mystery. Something went in. After a period of time in the dark, something different came out. The change was real and permanent. The grape juice could not be unmade back into grape juice once fermentation had occurred. What emerged from the vessel was irreversibly a different thing from what had entered it. This irreversibility was part of what made wine, in the Greek understanding, a genuinely sacred substance rather than just a useful one. The transformation was not reversible. The dissolution of ordinary consciousness that wine produced in the drinker was temporary, sobriety returned, but the wine itself could not be made back into what it had been before. It had undergone the kind of change that the Greeks associated with divine action, the kind of change that myths described when they talked about metamorphosis, a thing becoming permanently something other than what it was. The vine, in this sense, was a living example of the transformative power that the god embodied. Every vintage was a small-scale version of the story Dionysus had enacted when he first pressed his thumb into the fruit on those eastern hillsides and understood what it could become. Wine was also, in the Greek religious understanding, a substance that moved. It moved between regions, carried on trading ships. It moved through time, aging in its sealed containers. It moved between people, passed from hand to hand at the gathering in the formal sequence of the symposium. And it moved between the human and the divine, opening in the body of the drinker a temporary passage toward the experience that the gods had by nature. Each of these movements was understood as a reflection of the god's own character, which was above all the character of a traveler, a figure who did not stay in one place, who carried his gifts from east to west through territories that did not know what was coming. The god's image on the painted vessels was the image of someone already arrived, already settled in his vine leaf crown, but the mythology surrounding him was always the mythology of movement. He had come from somewhere. He was always, in one way or another, still arriving. The vine was the same. It was not native to every place it eventually grew. It had been carried, planted in new soil, tended by people who had learned the knowledge from others, who had learned it from others still, in a chain of transmission that the myth condensed into the single figure of a god walking westward with the knowledge of fermentation in his hands. At a gathering on an evening in classical Athens, a large clay crater stood in the center of the room. The wine had been mixed with water according to the custom of the evening, the proportions agreed upon before the first cups were poured. Lamplight moved on the surface of the mixture, catching the slight motion of the liquid as the crater was tilted to fill each vessel. The room had been louder a moment ago. As the wine was properly settled and served, the atmosphere of the gathering changed in the way it always changed at this point in the evening, a slight softening in the voices, a slowing in the pace of the conversation, a widening in the quality of attention in the room. The first libation had already been poured, the liquid going deliberately onto the ground in the god's honor before anyone drank. This was not a gesture. In the Greek understanding of the practice, it was the actual beginning of the religious act. The acknowledgement that the wine being shared was not simply a beverage, but a substance in which the god was present, and that receiving it properly required the same attention that any genuine encounter with the divine required. The god's presence in the room was not a metaphor at this point in the evening. It was what the ritual was designed to acknowledge, and in the acknowledging to receive. The surface of the crater caught the lamp's light and held it for a moment. The warm gold of the flame reflected and slightly dispersed in the dark liquid underneath. The room was quieter than it had been. The evening had moved from the first part, the eating, the social arrangements, the conversation that preceded the drinking, into the second part, which was the part that belonged to Dionysus. What happened from here in the evening was the god's gift, received in the form that centuries of accumulated practice had worked out for receiving it, with water mixed in, with libations properly made, in a room with other people, under conditions that allowed the dissolving effects of the wine to be shared and witnessed, and eventually gently brought to a close. What the Greeks understood about wine, they had learned slowly. It had taken generations of practice, of ritual refinement, of the kind of careful communal thinking that results in formal ceremony. The god had provided the substance, and in the mythological account, the initial knowledge of how to make it. Everything that came after that, the symposium, the crater, the custom of dilution, the libations, the formal structure of the gathering, was the human world's response to the gift, its attempt to build a container large enough and careful enough to hold something that carried, inside it, a presence that was not entirely human. The lamp burned quietly above the crater. The surface of the wine was still. The room had grown easy and unhurried in the way that rooms grow easy when the wine has arrived at the right point in the evening, not overwhelming, not demanding, but present in a way that loosened the ordinary rigid architecture of the gathering and allowed something more comfortable and spacious to occupy the room in its place. This was the god's gift in its fully refined form, not the raw fermentation on an eastern hillside, not the bewilderment of the Attic shepherds encountering something they had no framework for. This, the warm lamp, the dark liquid, the quiet room, the ceremonial vessel at the center of a gathering that understood what it was receiving, was what the centuries of practice had been building toward. Wine made ordinary and sacred at the same time. The god present in the room at the right concentration, in a form the mortal world could hold. The road east from the Aegean began in dry hills. The vegetation there was familiar, low scrub, gray-green, and fragrant in the heat, the kind of plants that grow close to the ground as though saving themselves for a season that might not come. The distances between known landmarks were manageable. A traveler moving east from the Greek world in the centuries when these myths were being told could still read the landscape, could still find, in the angle of a particular hillside or the smell of a particular wind off the sea, the outlines of a world he recognized. Then the hills changed, the plants changed, the names on the roads grew longer and stranger, and the air, by slow degrees, became something different, warmer, heavier, carrying the particular weight of land that has been inhabited longer than any single story can account for. This was the direction Dionysus traveled. Not westward yet, not toward the Greek cities that would eventually make him one of their own, but east and south, and further east still, into Phrygia, into Lydia, into countries whose hillsides were already thick with the vine, whose people already knew things about the world that the Greeks were only beginning to understand. The tradition of Dionysus as a traveler is one of the oldest and most persistent threads in the accounts that survive about him. He was never quite still in the way that other gods could be still, anchored to a mountain, fixed to a particular sanctuary, content to receive offerings from a single city. Something in his nature required movement, required the kind of encounter that only comes from arriving somewhere new, and the mythological geography that accumulated around him over centuries is in its own way a map of everything the ancient world imagined as strange and abundant and worth knowing. Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century before the Common Era, traced the god's wanderings in detail. Nonnus of Panopolis, composing his 48-book epic, The Dionysiaca in the 5th century of the Common Era, an enormous, sprawling work that treats the Indian campaign as the central event of the god's entire life. Imagine the journey east as the defining action of Dionysiac mythology, more fundamental even than the god's unusual birth, more central than the gift of the vine itself. What the Dionysiaca describes is a god at the head of a vast company, moving through landscape after landscape, carrying something with him that the world had not yet received. In Nonnus's account, this company was not small. There were the Manadotes, the women who moved and danced at the god's direction. There were the satyrs, those half-human figures who appear so persistently in early Greek art, with their horsetails and snub noses, their pointed ears, their air of uninhibited and slightly anarchic vitality. There was Silenus, who will require his own attention in a moment. And there were divine allies, figures from the wider Olympian world who took Dionysus's side as the campaign moved eastward through increasingly unfamiliar terrain. Ancient sources consistently describe this as an army of a kind, but the word army suggests a discipline and a severity that doesn't quite fit. The Dionysiac company moved to music as much as it moved to strategy, and the accounts of the Indian campaign in Nonnus carry the specific flavor of something between a procession and a conquest, between a religious ceremony and a war, the two modes not quite resolving into each other at any point. The tradition of Alexander the Great's propagandists reaching for this same myth is not incidental. When Alexander marched east in the 4th century before the Common Era, his court historians and image makers consciously invoked Dionysus's Indian campaign as a frame for what their leader was doing. Alexander was, in this telling, completing or echoing or surpassing the god's own journey, carrying Greek civilization into the same territories that Dionysus had entered long before. The comparison was politically useful, but it also tells something true about how deeply the Indian campaign was embedded in Greek understanding of what Dionysus meant, that the eastward journey was not a peripheral myth, but a central one, the god's nature expressed precisely in the act of moving into the unknown and changing it by arriving. Before the campaign moved east, or alongside it in some versions, Dionysus was understood to have passed through Egypt. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century before the Common Era, noted strong parallels between the worship of Osiris in Egypt and the worship of Dionysus among the Greeks. Both cults were ecstatic in character, both centered on themes of death and renewal. Both were bound up with agricultural abundance in ways that the more austere, sacrificial forms of Greek worship were not. Herodotus was careful about these comparisons. He did not flatten the differences between the two traditions, and he was explicit that he believed the Greeks had received certain things from the Egyptians over time, rather than the other way. But the parallels he identified were genuine, and the Greek mythographers who imagined Dionysus passing through the Nile Delta were drawing on a real felt sense that these two figures occupied similar territory in their respective cosmological worlds. To walk through the Nile Delta in the season when the river is high is to move through a landscape that is almost entirely water and green. The papyrus reeds grow very tall along the channels, taller than a standing man, dense enough to close out any view except the narrow path of water or sky directly ahead. The air is thick and warm and carries the smell of mud and living vegetation in equal proportion, and the light has a quality that is particular to flat, water-covered places, diffuse, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, making shadows soft and distances uncertain. The myth places Dionysus in this landscape without dwelling on what he did there, which gives the passage through Egypt the quality of all the most resonant parts of a long journey, the part that is not the destination, the part that changes you in ways you only understand afterward. Alexandria, which would not exist until long after the period the myths describe, later became an important center of Dionysiac worship under the Ptolemaic rulers, who identified themselves with the god, finding in his nature something that corresponded to their own position as rulers, who were both foreign and native, both Greek and Egyptian, both divine and uncomfortably mortal. Thrace was a different kind of country, north of the Aegean, inland from the sea, in ways that Greece was not. Thrace appears repeatedly in Dionysiac mythology as a transitional zone, the place the god moved through on his way between the Eastern world and the Greek world he was approaching. Thrace had its own robust wine culture, its own traditions of ecstatic worship, its own relationship with the kind of religious experience that dissolved the boundary between the human and the divine. The myth that is embedded in Thracian geography and which is referenced in Homer's Iliad, making it one of the oldest surviving Dionysiac stories, concerns Lycurgus, king of the Edoni in Thrace, who drove Dionysus and his followers into the sea. What the Iliad records is brief. Lycurgus drove the nurses of Dionysus across the sacred ground of Nysa with an ox goad. Dionysus, terrified, dived into the sea, where Thetis received him. The detail of Thetis's reception, a sea goddess sheltering the god of the vine in the salt water, holding him there until the danger passed, has an odd tenderness to it, a quality of unexpected refuge in an unlikely place. Later elaborations of the myth filled in what Homer left sparse. Lycurgus, in these versions, was driven to divine madness as punishment for his resistance. In the madness, he killed his own son, believing him to be a vine that needed cutting. And then, because Thrace's land had become barren as a result of Lycurgus's offense against the god, the people of Thrace killed their own king to restore the country's fertility. The land needed the death to recover. The pattern is consistent with what the tradition holds about resistance to Dionysus generally, not a simple punishment handed down from above, but a working out of consequences that unfolds through the very fabric of the natural world, the land itself participating in the demonstration. It is worth settling for a moment with Silenus. In the mythological accounts, Silenus was the god's tutor and his closest companion across the entire span of his wandering life. Ancient sources depict him as rotund, comfortably, enormously rotund, a figure in whom excess has become its own kind of completeness. He was perpetually drunk, in the way that certain figures in mythology are perpetually something, not as a temporary state, but as a condition of existence, the way water is perpetually wet and fire is perpetually warm. He was anciently wise, which is a specific kind of wisdom, the kind that arrives not through discipline or study, but through having been present for an enormous and particular accumulation of experience, through having sat at enough fires and crossed enough roads and drunk from enough skins that the patterns underneath ordinary events have become, over time, visible. He rode a donkey because he could not reliably walk in a straight line, and the donkey appears in ancient art with the same patient, slightly resigned expression that donkeys tend to wear in the presence of the decisions of others. The wine cup in Silenus's hand was never entirely empty. Under a tree somewhere between two cities, somewhere between any two cities, at any point on any road, he could be found asleep, with it loosely held in one hand, his great round belly rising and falling with the specific depth of a sleep that has no anxiety in it at all. The satyrs who traveled with Dionysus were, in early Greek art, clearly non-human. Later representations softened the distinction, gave them more human proportions, reduced the animal features to something more decorative than structural. But in the earliest images, the difference was marked. Horsetails, ears that came to points, noses that were broad and upturned in ways that suggested animal ancestry without committing to any single species. They played the aulos, the double-piped instrument, whose sound carries over open ground with a penetrating, slightly nasal quality that is not quite like any other music. They danced, they drank. They embodied something the ancient Greeks found both necessary and slightly dangerous to look at directly, the principle of vitality before it is shaped into anything, the energy of natural life before civilization applies its useful and constraining pressures. At the end of a day's travel, when the gods' company stopped somewhere on a hillside, the satyrs would play. The sound of those pipes carrying downhill into a valley below would be the first announcement that Dionysus was approaching, not a herald sent ahead on a horse, not a formal declaration of intent, but music drifting down through the cooling air of evening to a place where no one had yet heard the god's name or understood what was coming toward them. The story that the Homeric hymn to Dionysus tells is compact and precise and has been carried forward essentially intact across a very long time. Dionysus was standing on a seashore. The accounts describe him as a young man, beautiful in the way the divine often chose to appear to mortals who did not yet know what they were looking at, wearing nothing that would identify him, carrying nothing that would give him away. Tyrrhenian pirates passed on a ship. They saw a beautiful young man standing alone on a seashore, and they made the decision that pirates make when they see something valuable and apparently undefended. They took him aboard. They imagined they would sell him, or ransom him, or make some profitable use of a young man who appeared to be traveling alone and unprotected and far from anyone who might object. The helmsman of the ship knew. Ancient sources record his recognition in exactly the terms one might expect from a tradition that was shaped by people who understood how recognition worked. Not a logical deduction, not an accumulation of evidence, but a sudden and complete knowledge that arrived all at once and left no room for the alternative reading. He said, "This is a god, release him." The crew did not listen, and what happened next proceeded with the particular inevitability of mythological consequence, not rushed, not angry in tone, but simply the working out of a reality that had been in place from the moment the pirates made their decision. Wine began to flow across the deck, not from any visible source, not from a jar that had been opened or a skin that had been punctured, but simply appearing, spreading across the boards of the ship, in a dark sweetness that had no explanation within the world the pirates understood. Then grapevines, growing up the mast with a speed that does not belong to anything in the natural order of vine growth, their tendrils finding the wood and climbing it, their leaves spreading out into the salt air above the deck. Ivy through the rigging. The ropes themselves seemed to change, become organic, become part of a living system that the ship no longer governed. A lion appeared on the forward deck. A phantom bear materialized in the stern. The lion and the bear did not attack. They simply were there, suddenly and completely, in a space too small for them, and the fact of their presence was sufficient. The pirates leaped into the sea. One by one they went over the sides, and as they entered the water they changed. The myth describes this with the matter-of-fact attention to detail that characterizes the best Homeric narration, the specific quality of skin becoming hide, the specific sensation of limbs rearranging themselves into something other than what they had been, the specific moment when a man's relationship to the water changed from drowning to swimming, not because he found his footing, but because he had become the thing that swam. Dolphins, They moved together through the Aegean in close formation, their shapes just visible as dark curves through clear water, swimming in the same direction with no urgency and no apparent confusion about what they now were. The only man left on the ship was the helmsman who had known, and the god stood at the stern and told him he had found favor, that recognition was its own form of safety. In a world where the divine moved through ordinary spaces, in ordinary shapes, and required only that it be seen for what it was. What makes the Homeric hymn interesting alongside the longer traditions of Dionysus's wandering is the compression of it. Everything the god's longer journeys accomplished over thousands of miles and years of travel, the confrontation with resistance, the demonstration of what he was, the transformation of the world that encountered him, happened aboard a single ship in a single afternoon. The scale was different. The shape was the same. In Thrace, across the vastness of the Indian campaign, on the slow road through Egypt and the Nile Delta, through every city that resisted and every landscape that received him, Dionysus was doing what the ship demonstrated in miniature, entering a space that did not know what it was receiving, allowing that ignorance to run its natural course, and then simply being what he was, until the space transformed around him. The journey was also the god's education, in a way that the tradition doesn't always make explicit, but that the accumulated details support. A figure who moves through Phrygia and Lydia and Egypt and Thrace and out across the Aegean and then east into India is a figure who has been changed by more landscapes and more encounters than any settled deity can accumulate. The wisdom of Dionysus, in the mythological accounts, is not the abstract wisdom of a god who knows everything from above. It is something more specific, more textured, more related to the particular knowledge of what happens when wine is offered to a shepherd who has never tasted it, or when a king decides that the ordinary rules of hospitality apply to a drunk old man found sleeping in the rose garden, or when a helmsman on a pirate vessel looks at a young man standing quietly at the bow and understands, in a way he cannot explain to his crew, exactly what is happening. The rose garden, in fact, belongs here. The myth of Midas of Phrygia, king of Gordian, begins not with the golden touch, but with an act of hospitality that the tradition records as genuinely gracious. Silenus had wandered from the company, drunk as he perpetually was, and therefore not entirely reliable in terms of maintaining a specific geographical position relative to the group. He was found asleep in the rose gardens of Midas, among the flowers, his wine cup still resting in the grass beside him. The roses were blooming around him in the way that roses bloom when no one is particularly attending to them, fully, without self-consciousness, each flower completing its own small formal process, entirely indifferent to whether it was observed. Midas, in the ancient accounts, had him brought in and hosted him for 10 days, not as a prisoner, not as a curiosity to be displayed, but as a guest, in the specific and serious sense that hospitality carried in the ancient world, fed, sheltered, given the full consideration of a house that took its obligations seriously. After 10 days, Midas returned Silenus to Dionysus, and the god, grateful in the specific way that divine gratitude expresses itself in mythology, not with moderate thanks, but with the offer of a wish, any wish, whatever the mortal who had been generous could name, asked Midas what he wanted. Midas asked that everything he touched be turned to gold. The tradition does not describe Dionysus's response to this request in any detail that survives. What it records is that the wish was granted, and that what Midas received was exactly what he had asked for, and that this turned out to be something quite different from what he had imagined when he formed the request. Food became gold, water became gold, Whatever he reached for completed its transformation before he could use it for the purpose it had been intended for. The fullness of the gift was indistinguishable from its catastrophe. When Dionysus directed Midas to bathe in the river Pactolus in Lydia, the river received the golden touch from the king's skin, and afterward ran with gold dust, which the ancient sources connect directly to the Pactolus's historical reputation as a gold-bearing river, the kind of river whose banks were actually worked for gold by people who knew it carried something valuable. The myth settled into the landscape. The landscape kept the evidence. There is a quality to Dionysus's presence in all these stories that is consistent across the enormous range of sources and settings and centuries, from Homer's brief acknowledgement in the Iliad to Nonnus's vast elaboration in the Dionysiaca, from the Homeric hymn's single ship to the 40-year Indian campaign, from the Phrygian rose garden to the Nile Delta. The quality is something like inevitability, not the inevitability of fate in the sense of something fixed and predetermined. The tradition is not quite as deterministic as that, but a sense that what Dionysus brings with him is in the end not resistible, not because he forces it, but because it is something the world was already ready for, something the world needed and was only waiting for the moment of encounter to receive. The resistance that kings and cities and their rulers offered was not, in the tradition's framing, evidence that the god could be stopped. It was evidence that the process of his arrival took the specific form that arrival always takes: encounter, misrecognition, consequence, and then, finally, the knowledge that was there the whole time, emerging from the event it created. The wanderings covered an enormous amount of ground: eastern hillsides where the vine grew in conditions it found hospitable, the flat green country of Egypt where the river made the air heavy and warm, the transitional zone of Thrace where resistance was noted and paid for, the wide water of the Aegean where the sea received both the god and the creatures his judgment made, the Indian territories in the Far East where the campaign went and returned from in the accounts that imagine it most fully. And through all of this, the company traveled, Silenus on his donkey, the satyrs with their pipes and their endless impractical vitality, the Maenads moving in the god's train, and Dionysus himself in front, or among them, or sometimes ahead of them, already at the edge of the next territory when the rest were still crossing the one before. The passage across the Aegean is the part that stays, not because it was the largest part of the journey. The Indian campaign in Nonnus's version makes the ship voyage look like an afternoon errand by comparison, but because the sea has a quality, in narration, of opening things out. A road through dry hills is one kind of progress. A road through the delta is another, but the Aegean, with its particular quality of light and its particular scale, not the enormous featureless scale of an ocean, but the intimate island-punctuated scale of a sea that keeps offering the traveler the sight of land on the horizon, has always functioned in Greek mythology as a threshold space, the place where one thing ends and another is about to begin, where transformation happens in the crossing rather than on arrival, where a man on a ship can become something in the water before he reaches the other shore. The dolphins that were the pirates, in the Aegean, in close formation, just below the surface, their shapes visible from above as dark curves moving through clear water, their passage smooth and apparently effortless, their direction consistent. There is nothing in the water around them to indicate what they had been before the crossing changed them. They move as dolphins move, which is to say, with a kind of ease that suggests the body is entirely suited to the element it inhabits, that the relationship between the creature and the water around it, has been settled so completely that effort is no longer the right word for what it takes to move through it. Whatever they knew before, the specific human knowledge of a ship's deck underfoot, of a particular Aegean port, of a captain's voice, and the sound of oars, and the smell of rope and salt, and the specific gravity of a life lived at the edge of legitimate commerce, that knowledge had been replaced by this: the clear water, the direction, the unhurried movement through an element that was now exactly their own. The tradition holds that only the helmsman was spared, which means the helmsman was left on the vine-covered ship, the lion and the bear presumably departing at some point that the hymn doesn't specify, the grapevines presumably remaining, growing against the mast as the vessel drifted wherever the current took it, without a crew to direct it. The hymn does not follow the ship after the god's demonstration is complete. The myth has achieved what it came to achieve, and the remaining practical questions: where the ship went, what happened to the helmsman, what the vines did as they continued growing in the salt air above the Aegean, are left to the space beyond the account, where interesting things can continue to exist without being narrated. The wandering life described across these accounts was not merely geographical, it was cosmological. Dionysus moved through the world the way certain ideas move through a culture, gradually, through contact and encounter and resistance and eventual accommodation, arriving in each new place as something foreign and then becoming, over time, so thoroughly absorbed that it is difficult to remember the arrival at all. The Greek cities that received his cult, the festivals they established, the rituals they built around the wine and the vine, and the specific form of religious experience his worship offered, these were the destinations the wandering was leading toward. But the journey was the content. The wandering was not a prologue to the god's settled life. It was the thing itself. The sea accepted them. The dolphins moved through the Aegean in their close formation, their backs just breaking the surface, occasionally in that specific way that dolphins surface, not to pause, not to rest, but as a continuous part of forward movement, a breath taken without slowing down. The water around them was clear enough, in the shallow coastal regions of the Aegean, to show the sandy bottom in certain lights, the particular pale gold of Aegean seabed, where the depth was right, and the angle of the sun was direct. They moved through this light, and through the shadow cast by cloud, and through the darker water between the islands, where the depth increased, and the bottom was no longer visible. They moved as creatures move, who are entirely at home in the place they inhabit, whatever the crossing had cost, whatever form of loss is contained in a transformation you did not choose. The evidence of it had been absorbed into the ease of how they now traveled, inseparable from the motion itself, present only as the particular quality of creatures who are entirely suited to the element they inhabit, and going, without apparent urgency, in one direction across water that received them as simply and completely as it received everything else that moved through it. At the edge of a Greek city, in the last gray light before full dark, the gate stood open still. A group of women passed through it. They moved in the same direction, toward the mountain rather than away from it, and they carried with them the thyrsus, the long fennel stalk crowned with pine and wound in ivy, held upright and unhurried against the cooling air. The gatekeeper watched them go. He did not stop them. He took a half step back without quite deciding to, and then they were past him, and the path beyond the gate was swallowing them into the dusk. This was a crossing, not a transgression, a crossing. What lay inside the wall was the city, ordered and known, its streets named, and its laws posted, and its markets closed for the evening. What lay outside and upward where the path climbed toward the dark line of the mountain's ridge, was something the city had made room for in its calendar and its customs, something it could not entirely contain and had long since learned not to try. The women walking toward the mountain were not fleeing the city. The city had, in its way, sanctioned their departure, but the mountain did not belong to the city. The mountain, in the season that called for this, belonged to Dionysus. The name of what those women were practicing was Oribasia. The word means, at its simplest, mountain roaming. It was a specific Dionysiac rite, a going out at night by groups of women to perform ecstatic worship on mountain slopes, in the cold and the darkness and the particular air that existed above the level of ordinary civic life. Plutarch, writing in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, records a specific occasion when a group of Maenads from Delphi undertook Oribasia in winter and wandered in the snow to the town of Amphissa. When they arrived, they were exhausted, and they lay down in the marketplace and slept there on the ground. The women of Amphissa, knowing what these women were, knowing where they had come from and what they had been doing, gathered around them in the dark and stood in a quiet ring while the Delphic Maenads slept, cold and spent, wrapped in their ritual skins. No one asked them to leave. No one disturbed them. The women of Amphissa simply stood there through the night, close enough to shelter, far enough not to wake them. This is the image that persists. Not torchlight on a mountain slope, not the ecstatic cry in the dark air, but women asleep on the stones of a market square, their breath clouding in the cold, and around them the ordinary women of a small Greek city, standing in a quiet circle, protecting their sleep without being asked. Something about that image holds the Dionysiac rite and the civic world in the same frame, and shows them not in conflict, but in a kind of care for each other that requires no explanation between them. The women, the tradition called Maenads, appear in 2 registers that are worth holding separately. In myth, they are the divine companions of Dionysus himself, the figures who appear on painted pottery and in choral poetry, crowned with snakes and ivy, carrying the thyrsus and the fawn skin, perpetually in motion across the hillsides of a world that is always just past the edge of the civilized. In history, they are mortal women, participants in documented religious practice, their activities regulated and acknowledged by civic institutions. An inscription from Miletus, dating to the early 3rd century BCE, records civic authority taking an active role in the organization of Maenad ritual activity. This was not underground worship, not a cult in hiding. The inscription is administrative. It reads like a municipal record, because that is what it is. The city of Miletus had incorporated Maenad rites into its official religious calendar, with enough formality to require written regulation. The name itself comes from the Greek verb maianomai, meaning to rage or to be mad, but the word, by the time it had settled into the tradition's usage, carried something more specific than mere disorder. The madness associated with Dionysiac rites was understood in ancient Greek religious thought as a particular kind of ecstasis, a standing outside oneself, a temporary dissolution of the ordinary boundaries that separated the mortal self from something larger than that self. It was not the madness of illness or of breakdown. It was sought. It was seasonal. It had its proper time and its proper forms, and when those forms were completed, the participants returned to the city, to their houses, to their ordinary lives. The ecstasy was bounded. The dissolution was temporary. The rite was, among other things, an exercise in crossing a threshold and coming back from it. The instrument they carried, the thyrsus, deserves particular attention. It was not an ornamental object, though it appears as decoration on so many painted surfaces that it is easy to treat it as one. The thyrsus was a staff made from the stalk of Ferula communis, giant fennel, topped with a pine cone and wound with ivy and vine leaves. Fennel grows tall in the Mediterranean, its hollow stalk rising head high or taller, its yellow flowers catching dust and light. When you break the stalk, the interior is not solid wood, but fibrous, light, and dry, and running through its center is a channel of empty space. That hollow center was not decorative or accidental. It was, in the tradition's understanding, the point. The myth of Prometheus tells how fire was stolen from the gods and given to mortals, and it holds within it the specific detail of how the theft was accomplished, not in a jar or a vessel, but in a hollow stalk of fennel, the flame carried hidden inside the plant where the gods could not see it burning. The thyrsus carried that image forward into Dionysiac practice. The fennel stalk, with its concealed channel, its apparent modesty, its ordinary botanical surface, became the object that contained divine power, without appearing to contain anything at all. To carry the thyrsus was, in this tradition's logic, to carry something concealed, power held inside the ordinary, the sacred moving through the world in a form the world could pass without recognizing. The pine cone at its tip connected the thyrsus to a different set of associations, the resinous, aromatic, ancient presence of the mountain forest, the high slopes where pines grew above the tree line, and the air thinned, and the city was far below. The ivy wound around the shaft was living plant, and ivy was particularly associated with Dionysus throughout the tradition, appearing in his imagery from very early periods, covering the surfaces of his temples, twining through the rigging of ships in the most famous of his myths. The thyrsus was, in its complete form, a kind of summary, the stolen fire, the mountain forest, the living vine, the essential territories of the god held together in one object that could be carried in a human hand. Plutarch held that at Delphi, the most authoritative oracle site in the ancient Greek world and the primary sanctuary of Apollo, the sacred year was divided between two divine presences. For 9 months, Apollo held the sanctuary. The oracle spoke in his season. The laurel was his. The precision and the clarity were his. The clean edge of prophetic knowledge, the form and the measure. But for 3 months in winter, Apollo was understood to travel to the far country of the Hyperboreans, and in those months Delphi belonged to Dionysus. Not as a diminishment, not as a temporary compromise, but as the expression of something the ancient Greeks understood about the two gods, which was that they were not opposites in the sense of canceling each other, but complements in the sense of completing each other, each being what the other was not, and both being necessary. This is an arrangement worth dwelling on. Delphi was the navel of the world in Greek cosmological understanding. The omphalos stone in its inner sanctuary marked the spot where 2 eagles released by Zeus from opposite ends of the earth had met, identifying the exact center of everything. That center, that most authoritative sacred space, was held not by one god alone but by 2, in alternating seasons, each making room for what the other was. In the months when the oracle fell silent and the snow covered the upper paths of Mount Parnassus, it was Dionysus who inhabited the sanctuary. The rational precision of prophecy gave way to something older and less articulable, and the oracle's silence was understood, not as absence, but as a different kind of divine presence, one that did not speak in the clean language of prediction, but in the older language of dissolution and return. The mountain behind Delphi is Parnassus. Its upper slopes in winter are bare and cold, and the path from the sanctuary to those heights winds through rock and pale scrub, ascending through cold air to a silence that is complete. From the upper heights, the city is very small. The cultivated fields of the plain below, the road to the sea, the harbor at Itea, the particular human scale of everything down there, all of it shrinks to something that can be held in one glance, and the mountain continues above the glance for some time. It was to those heights or to mountains like them that the Maenadids went in the season of Oribacea. The going up was part of the practice. The distance from the city was part of the practice. What the tradition sought in altitude was a release from the scale at which ordinary life was lived, and a brief experience of a different scale entirely. Spargmos is the Greek word for tearing apart. It appears in the mythological record as the act that marks the most extreme boundary of Dionysiac practice, the rending of a living animal with bare hands, performed in the depths of the rite by worshippers in the height of ecstatic dissolution. In Euripides's Bacchae, written in the late 5th century BCE, and first performed after the playwright's death, the act figures centrally in the fate of Pentheus, who becomes the object of the rite rather than its witness. The dramatic power of that reversal is the structural engine of the whole play. But the scholar Walter Burkert, working in the late 20th century, argued for a reading of Sparagmos that places its function not in its surface violence, but in what that violence was understood to accomplish: the dissolution of the boundary between human and animal and divine, the three orders of being temporarily collapsed into one another through an act that could not be contained within ordinary categories. It was, on this reading, a limit experience, an extreme station on the path of dissolution that the rite traced. The act mattered less as an act than as the crossing of the outermost boundary, the point at which the ordinary self had released everything it ordinarily held. This is worth noting without enlarging. The tradition preserves the image of Sparagmos without asking the modern reader to find it comfortable. What the ancient Greek religious world understood about the practice was that it belonged to a specific place and time and function, that it was part of a structure, not a collapse of structure. The rite was bounded, the boundaries were important, and the women who participated and returned were participants in something their civic world recognized, regulated, and in certain ways protected. The thyrsus appears in a phrase that ancient commentators recorded and that has traveled through centuries of scholarship. The thyrsus carriers are many, but the bacchoi are few. The bacchoi were those who had genuinely experienced what the rite sought, not merely performed its external forms, but arrived at the internal state. The forms were designed to facilitate, to carry the thyrsus, the staff, the fennel and ivy and pine cone held in one's hand, was one thing. To become a true bacchois, to have undergone the dissolution and returned from it changed, was another. The distinction mattered. The outer practice was widely available. The inner experience was rare, and the rarity was understood not as a failure of the rite, but as evidence of what the rite was attempting, which was genuinely difficult and genuinely beyond most people's reach, as real transformation tends to be. The Maenads who appear on Attic pottery, red figure vases from the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, their images fired into clay and traded from city to city across the Aegean, are almost always in motion. They do not stand still on the vases. They lean back, their hair loose, their arms extended, the thyrsus angled into the air, or the fawn skin swinging from one hand. They are on the mountain, or at the edge of the mountain, or in the space that is neither the city nor the wilderness, but the threshold between them. The potters who painted them were working in a tradition of representation so established that the images had become their own kind of language. You did not need to know the specific myth. You saw the ivy and the fawn skin, and the thyrsus, and the particular angle of the head thrown back, and you understood that you were looking at Dionysiac ecstasy in its recognizable form. That recognizability is itself interesting. Ecstasy, in the Dionysiac tradition, had a shape. It had a vocabulary of gesture and attribute that could be painted onto a clay vessel and carried to a buyer who would recognize it immediately. The wildness was not shapeless. The dissolution had a known outline, and the outline was transmitted across generations of potters and buyers and owners, the image of the monad becoming part of the visual grammar of the ancient Greek world so thoroughly that it was nearly as familiar as the image of the god himself. The image of Dionysus on those vases is typically one of a young man, or sometimes an older, heavy-bearded figure, crowned with vine leaves and grape clusters, holding a cantharos, the deep wine cup with the high handles, or the thyrsus, or sometimes both. He is often seated among his company, satyrs to one side, maenads to another, Silenus perhaps resting nearby with his perpetual cup. The compositions are domestic in their own way, the divine household, the traveling court of the god, arranged on a curved surface in the workshop light of an Athenian potter's district. These are objects made for use, for drinking from, or pouring from, or carrying wine in. They were made for symposia, for the specifically Greek institution of the after-dinner drinking party, at which wine was mixed with water in a large clay crater and poured into the gathered cups of the participants, and at which poetry was recited, and music was played, and the conversation ran toward philosophy or politics or the particular pleasures of the evening. The symposium was not a ritual in the formal sense, but the mixing of wine in the crater was attended by specific customs. The proportions of wine to water were decided by the host, or by lot. Libations were poured to the gods before drinking began, and Dionysus was the implicit presence at the table. To drink wine in ancient Greek practice was to participate in something that belonged to the god, not in the extreme form of the Maenad on the mountain, but in the domesticated and civic form of the symposium, where the ecstasy was mild and the dissolution was carefully proportioned, and the boundary between the ordinary self and something slightly beyond it was crossed gently and then stepped back across by mourning. The relationship between those two ends of the spectrum, the Maenad in the heights of Orobasia and the symposiast in the lamplit room, is not a contradiction. They are different gradations of the same practice, different points on the path that Dionysiac worship traced between the ordinary self and the dissolution of the ordinary self. The mountain rite went further. The symposium stayed closer to the civic, but both were understood as encounters with the same god, through the same substance, wine, which carried the god's presence in it, and both were understood as forms of communion that the ordinary world did not provide in any other way. Delphi in winter carried the silence of an oracle that had stopped speaking. The great temple stood unchanged. The omphalostone sat in its inner chamber, as it always sat. The treasuries of the Greek city-states lined the sacred way, as they always lined it. But the specific atmosphere of the place was altered by the season, and by what the tradition held about the season, that the precise prophetic ordered presence of Apollo had withdrawn, and that something else now inhabited the sanctuary, not a vacancy, a different occupancy, a different occupancy. Ivy grew over the lower steps of the temple in winter. This is the kind of detail that the tradition holds, and that rewards attention. Ivy, the living plant, the creeping and persistent vine of Dionysus, covering the steps of Apollo's sanctuary in the months of the god's absence, not as vandalism, but as the natural expression of the season. In summer, in Apollo's months, the ivy would be cleared or kept back. In winter, it was permitted its progress. The two seasons of the sanctuary left different marks on the stone, and the plant knew when it was allowed to grow. The thyrsus held upright in firelight, pale fennel stalk, dark pine cone, the ivy leaves moving in the warm air that rose from below, was a specific kind of image, not an abstraction of divine power, but a particular object in a particular light, the things that made it significant visible rather than stated. The hollow inside the stalk, the channel of empty space running through the ordinary surface of the plant, was not visible from the outside, but the people who carried it knew it was there. The knowledge of the hidden interior was part of what the object meant, power that does not announce itself, the sacred carried inside the ordinary, the God present in the thing that appears most simply botanical. There is a structural quality to the way Dionysiac ritual organized its spaces that is worth sitting with. The city was one space, the mountain was another. The sanctuary at Delphi was a third, a place that was neither fully civic nor fully wild, a consecrated ground that held both orders in alternating season. And threaded through all of these spaces was the vine, the grape that grew on the hillside, the fermented juice that moved in the sealed clay vessel, the wine that poured into the cup at the symposium or the libation bowl at the temple. The vine moved through all three spaces. The mountain and the city and the sanctuary were its different territories, and in each it was understood as the same substance, carrying the same presence, serving the same fundamental function, the temporary and controlled meeting of the mortal self with something that exceeded the mortal self. What the ancient Greek religious world did with this god and his rites was something more careful than it might appear from the outside. The Dionysiac tradition was not a crack in the civic order. It was, in the places where it functioned well, a valve, a designated time and space in which the pressure of ordinary civic selfhood could be released, the boundaries softened, the dissolution undertaken in its proper form, and then the return made. The Menaids of Miletus were regulated by inscription. The Monads of Delphi were protected in their sleep by the women of Amphissa. The women who passed through the city gate toward the mountain did so in a season the city had marked out for that purpose. The mountain was not outside the city's understanding. The city had included the mountain in its understanding by giving it its proper time. Mount Parnassus in winter, seen from the road below Delphi, shows its upper reaches as a pale mass against the gray sky of a January afternoon. The snow line sits above the tree line. Below the snow, the bare rock. Below the rock, the scrub and the cold gray-green of winter vegetation, the path disappearing into it. The sanctuary is lower still, sheltered from the worst of the weather by its position in the fold of the mountain. Standing at the sanctuary and looking up, the distance to the white heights seems very large, and yet the tradition held that the rites of Oribasia took women to those heights or to mountains comparable in scale in the dark of winter nights. The going up required something, not just physical endurance, though that was part of it, something about willingness, the willingness to leave the lit space below and climb into the dark above, carrying the thyrsus and the fawn skin and whatever the rite required into an altitude where the body was cold and the city was no longer visible, and the only light was what the company brought with it. That willingness was itself a practice. The approach to the mountain, the climb, the increasing distance from everything familiar, these were not incidental to the rite, but part of it, the threshold being crossed gradually, the ordinary self releasing its hold on ordinary territory, step by step, before arriving at the height where the rite itself was performed. The figure of Dionysus, moving through his own mythology, carries this quality of the threshold perpetually. He is the god who crosses between, who belongs fully to no single territory. He is the son of a mortal mother and an immortal father. He was born twice, from a woman's body and a god's thigh. He moves between east and west, between Greece and the lands beyond Greece. He inhabits the city's festival calendar and the mountain's winter night. He is present in the wine at the symposium and in the ecstasy at the summit. And at Delphi, he holds the sanctuary in the months when its other god is absent, occupying the space between one divine regime and another, at home in the interval. The 3 winter months at Delphi were his most quietly described domain in the tradition, not the theatrical campaign to India, not the punishment of the resistors, not the transformation of the pirates and their ship. Just 3 months in which the greatest sanctuary in the Greek world belonged to him. The oracle was silent, and the ivy grew a little further over the stone. Plutarch, who served as a priest at Delphi, and knew the sanctuary with the intimate knowledge of someone who had tended its calendar and its customs for years, records this arrangement with the tone of something settled and understood, not as paradox, but as balance, the 2 gods occupying the same consecrated ground in their proper alternation, each complete in their season. The thyrsus carried a fire that no one could see. The fennel stalk that looked like a walking stick carried inside it the mythological memory of a theft and a gift, the moment when mortal life acquired something it had not had before. The women who carried it through the city gate and up the mountain path were carrying an object whose surface was modest and whose interior was full. The pine cone at the top, the ivy wound around the hollow stalk, the cold air of the mountains surrounding it. And somewhere inside the tradition that placed all of this together, the plant and the fire and the women and the mountain and the god in his winter sanctuary, there was something the ancient Greek world understood about the relationship between what appears ordinary and what it contains. The oracle at Delphi was the place where the god Apollo spoke through a human voice, through the Pythia, the priestess who sat on her tripod above the vapors in the inner chamber and received what the god sent into her. The logic of the oracle was the logic of Apollo: precision, form, the word that carries a specific meaning. But the logic of the winter months, Dionysus's months, was different. Not the single word that answers a question, not the clean edge of prophetic utterance. Something more like the dissolution of the question itself, the self that asks dissolving into the larger thing it was asking about, and the answer not received from outside, but experienced from within. 2 logics, 1 sanctuary, each occupying its proper season with something that looked, from the outside, like an arrangement, and felt, from the inside, like necessity. Where the 2 gods met, in the calendar of Delphi, and the understanding of the ancient Greeks who organized that calendar, was at the edges of the year. The autumn that ended Apollo's season and handed the sanctuary to Dionysus, the spring that returned it. At those edges, the tradition placed various rites of transition, ceremonies of handing over, the specific liturgical work of moving from one divine mode into another. The edges were not empty. They were attended to. The transition from one season to the next was itself a sacred act, marked and observed. The shift between the clarity of Apollo and the dissolution of Dionysus, performed in its proper form by the priests who managed the sanctuary's continuity. This is the quality that the Dionysiac tradition, at its most settled, expressed, not chaos seeking to destroy order, not wildness in opposition to civilization, but the recognition built into the structure of civic and religious life, that order required its other, that the self which functioned in the world also required its periods of release from itself, that the bounded civic person also needed the mountain, and that these needs were real enough to warrant regulation, inscription, calendar, and the quiet protection of a circle of women standing through a winter night in the marketplace of Amphissa. The sanctuary at Delphi in those 3 winter months was a still place. The oracle made no pronouncements. The laurel was quiet. The great bronze tripod stood without its priestess. The path up from the coast to the sanctuary, which in Apollo's season was busy with pilgrims and suppliants, and the delegations of cities seeking guidance, was quieter now, colder, the travelers fewer. Inside the sanctuary, in the specific stillness of a closed oracle, the stone held the cold of the season, and the ivy moved very slightly in the wind that came down from Parnassus above. The god was present in the ivy, present in the vine that wound somewhere around the base of the temple columns, present in the season itself, which the tradition held as the gods not in claim against Apollo, but in rightful occupation of the interval. The thyrsus in firelight, the pine cone at the top, dark and resinous, the ivy wound around the pale stalk, the leaves catching the light, the hollow center of the fennel, invisible from the outside, running from the base of the staff to the crown. The god in his winter sanctuary, the oracle closed, the ivy growing at its own pace over the lower stones of Apollo's temple, unbothered and unhurried, the long green stems finding their way across the surface of the steppe. This was the god's quietest season, not the campaigns and the wanderings and the ecstatic ascents, not the transformation of the pirates, or the pursuit of the resistors, or the far eastern journey with its vast and following company. Just the winter months at Delphi, the oracle silent, the 2 divine presences alternating as they had always alternated, the sanctuary held open in its proper season by the god who belonged to the other end of what Apollo represented, and who was, in the tradition's understanding, not Apollo's opposite, but his complement, the thing without which the other could not be whole. In the 3 winter months, the ivy grew. In the spring, it was cut back. In the summer, the oracle spoke in the clear, precise Apollon mode of prophetic utterance. In the autumn, the exchange was made again. The sanctuary handed between one divine logic and another, and the maenads somewhere on the slopes of a mountain were roaming in the dark with their thursoi held upright, and the city below them had its gate standing open for their return, and the women of whatever city lay nearest were perhaps already laying out their own cloaks to cover the sleepers when they arrived, exhausted and cold, and lay down in the marketplace at last to rest. The sanctuary at Delphi in winter, the oracle closed, the stone cold, the ivy on the lower step moving in the slow air that came down from the mountain, the thyrsus held upright in the quiet of the sacred precinct, its pine cone dark at the tip, its ivy wound carefully around the hollow stalk, the god present in his season, unhurried and complete, occupying the consecrated ground as naturally as the ivy occupied the stone, the winter his, the silence his, the 3 months of the year in which the great oracle of the world kept its own counsel, and the god who knew something about dissolution and return held the sanctuary in his particular care, and the ivy continued its long, slow, purposeful work across the surface of the ancient steppe, and nothing disturbed it, and nothing needed to. The stone seats of the theater of Dionysus are cold before sunrise. Dew has settled on every tier of the great semicircle, and the circular orchestra floor below, the flat round space where the chorus will stand and turn and move in patterns as old as the city, is still in shadow, the darkness pooling there, while the sky above the Acropolis begins, very gradually, to lighten at its eastern edge. The city is audible below, not loud yet, not the full voice of Athens on a festival morning, but the first sounds of a city coming awake, cartwheels on stone, the early calls of vendors, water moving in a cistern somewhere down the hill. Here in the theater, none of that has quite arrived. The space is still held in its pre-festival quiet, the stone tier by tier descending toward that dark circle of floor, the whole structure waiting with a patience that belongs to places that have been waiting for a very long time. This theater was built on the slope of a hill sacred to Dionysus. The temple to the god stands nearby, and the theater itself was understood not as a civic amenity, but as a sacred precinct, a place where the god was present, where performances given in his name constituted an act of worship, where the thousands who came to watch tragedy and comedy were, in the formal sense of their tradition, attending a religious occasion. The earliest performances here, in the 6th and 5th centuries before the Common Era, were conducted in the god's honor during the Great Dionysia, a spring festival whose preparations, processions, and rites extended across several days. To sit in these seats was to participate in something that began with the god himself. That understanding, the theater as a place where Dionysus was genuinely present, not commemorated but actually there, runs through the whole long history of his cult. The Greeks did not think of the god as a figure from a distant past, whose stories they retold out of tradition or fondness. They understood him as an active presence, a god who arrived when called, who inhabited the performance, the wine, the ecstatic movement on the mountain, the music rising out of the chorus on the orchestra floor. And if that understanding was contested, if there were always those who found his demands excessive, who preferred the gods to remain in their temples and let the city conduct its affairs without divine disruption, then that contest too belongs to his story. The resistance and what follows from it is part of the record he left behind. Pentheus was a king of Thebes. In the version of his story that Euripides composed and that was performed, probably posthumously, in Athens around 405 years before the Common Era. Pentheus is not a simple figure, not a tyrant set up for easy punishment, not a man whose blindness is merely stupid. He is, in Euripides' hands, a more complicated thing, a king who understands the political threat the god presents, who fears the disruption of his city's order, who cannot accept that a power exists which will not submit to his authority, and who is drawn, in the play's most unsettling passages, into a strange and ambivalent fascination with the god he is trying to suppress. He refuses to acknowledge Dionysus as divine. He suppresses the cult. He imprisons the god's followers. And Dionysus in the play dismantles him, not through force, but through a slow and methodical dissolution of everything Pentheus used to understand himself. The pattern Euripides found in Pentheus was not unique to Thebes. The tradition held that wherever the god came to establish his cult, he encountered resistance, and the resistance was always, eventually, overcome, not always through violence, often through transformation, through the sudden movement of the resistant party into the god's own sphere, through a collapse of the certainty that had made resistance seem possible. What the myth returns to, again and again, is the image of an authority, a king, a civic order, a set of norms about how the world was organized and who controlled it, that tried to contain the god and found that the god would not be contained. The wall that seemed solid enough to hold him was not. The prison that seemed secure enough to hold his followers was not. The rational refusal to acknowledge his power was not, in the end, a form of power. In Thebes, Pentheus stood at a window, somewhere in the long evening before the play's conclusion, watching torchlight move on the mountain above the city. The light was visible from the walls, fires on Kithaeron, the mountain where the Maenads had gone, moving in patterns that made no sense from the distance of a city street. He could see that something was happening there, and he could not read it from where he stood. The window frame was cold under his hands. The mountain was above him, the fires small from that distance, and between him and them, the dark slope where his own city ended, and something else began. He chose, in the end, to go up. The tradition is consistent on what followed. The god met him on the mountain, and what came back down was not the same as what went up. The daughters of Minyas present a quieter version of the same pattern. Their city was Orchomenus, in the region of Boeotia, and their story is preserved in several sources. Plutarch, Ovid, Aelian, each giving it a somewhat different texture while preserving the same essential shape. Alcitho, Leucippe, and Arsinoe were the three daughters of King Minyas, and when the festival of Dionysus came to Orchomenus, they refused it. Their refusal was not violent, not royal, not a matter of civic policy. They simply stayed home. Their looms were set up and working. The shuttle went back and forth. The sound of the festival came through the walls, and then receded as the afternoon deepened into evening. There is something specific about that room, the specific domestic warmth of it, the light from the windows, the familiar rhythm of the loom, that makes the contrast with what was happening outside feel particular rather than abstract. Three women choosing the interior over the mountain, the known rhythm over the unfamiliar one, the weaving over the dance. The tradition does not present their choice as wicked, or even, at first, as mistaken. They had a preference. The god, in the tradition's accounting, noted the preference and was not pleased by it. The versions differ in their details of what followed, but in Ovid's telling the women were transformed into creatures of the night, into bats, small and dark, flickering through the space where the lamplight reached, and their story was said to explain the local Orchomenian festival called the Agrionia, in which a priest of Dionysus symbolically pursued women of the Minion family with a sword. The ritual carried the memory of the refusal forward, year by year, into a civic observance that reminded Orchomenus of what had happened when three women and their looms held out against something older than their city's founding. The tradition does not always frame resistance as a moral failing. What it consistently shows is the asymmetry between mortal authority and divine reality, the gap between what a king can command and what a god can require, between what a city can regulate and what arrives, in the end, whether the city is ready or not. Pausanias, in his 2nd century description of Greece, records an obscure local Argive tradition in which Perseus, the hero, the slayer of the Gorgon, the son of Zeus, was said to have fought against Dionysus when the god attempted to establish his cult in the Argolid region. Some versions place the defeated Dionysus in the lake of Lerna, that still and famously deep water in the flatlands south of Argos. Pausanias himself found the tradition puzzling. It seemed strange to him that the god could have been bested by a mortal hero, even a hero of Perseus' stature. Modern scholars, reading the same passage, have suggested that this odd local tradition might preserve the memory of something real, an actual historical resistance to the introduction of Dionysiac worship in that region, the cult meeting opposition before it was accepted, the myth encoding in the form of combat, what was probably a slower and more administrative process of negotiation and resistance. The god who arrived in the Argolid was not arriving for the first time. He was arriving in a land that already had its gods, its heroes, its own dense texture of cult and worship. Perseus had his shrines there. Hera had her great temple at the Herion, one of the oldest sacred sites in the Peloponnese. The Argive plain was already spoken for in the divine sense, and a new god coming to add his festivals, his maenads, his wine, his ecstatic rites to a religious calendar that already had a great deal in it, was not automatically welcome. The myth of Perseus and Dionysus fighting on the shores of Lerna might be, at some deep level, the compressed story of that arrival and the adjustment that followed, the settling over generations of what the god's presence in a new place would mean for the people already there. The story of Midas is different in its texture, quieter in its consequences, and peculiar in the way it places the king's relationship to Dionysus at the beginning of his trouble rather than at its end. Midas of Phrygia appears in the tradition as a generous host. Silenus, the ancient companion of Dionysus, wide and round and perpetually drowsing, who served as the god's tutor and oldest friend, was found asleep in the rose gardens of Midas at Gordion in Phrygia. He had wandered from the god's company, or been separated from it, or simply sat down among the roses to rest, and found that he could not stop resting. His wine cup was beside him in the grass. The roses were still blooming around him, unbothered by his presence, their smell heavy and sweet in the warm Phrygian air. Midas hosted Silenus for 10 days. He treated him well, not as a curiosity or a prisoner, but as a guest, which was in the Greek and broader ancient world one of the more serious obligations a man of position could undertake. After 10 days he returned the old companion to Dionysus, who was grateful in the specific way of a god whose beloved tutor has been well treated by a mortal king. He offered Midas a wish. Midas asked that everything he touched turn to gold. The god granted it, and what followed was exactly what a reasonable understanding of the wish would have predicted, and what Midas, in his eagerness, had not thought through. The food turned to gold, the water turned to gold, and Midas found himself in possession of an infinite and immediately catastrophic gift. He returned to Dionysus and asked to be released from it. The god told him to go to the river Pactolus in Lydia and bathe in its waters. And what flowed out of Midas in that river was his wish, and what the river carried in its waters afterward was gold dust, and the Pactolus, in the actual historical geography of the ancient world, was genuinely known for its gold-bearing sands. The myth arrived at a real place and explained a real thing, the way the best myths tend to do. What the story of Midas holds, at its quiet center, is an image of the god's generosity as something that requires wisdom to receive. The wish was not a trap. Dionysus did not trick Midas. He gave the king what the king asked for. The trouble was that Midas asked without thinking through what the gift would mean in practice, without considering that the world he lived in required things that gold could not provide, that the transformation he wanted would transform too much, that what seemed like an increase of power was in fact a removal of the ordinary capacity to touch things and find them still what they were. The god who gave wine to the world knew something about transformation. He knew that it changes what it touches. The question, always, was whether the person receiving the change was ready for what it meant. The tradition held that the god's gifts were genuine gifts. Wine, in the Greek understanding, was not a simple agricultural product, not merely fermented grape juice, useful for keeping liquids drinkable in a climate that was hard on water. It was a substance through which the mortal drinker could temporarily approach something that ordinary consciousness could not reach. It dissolved, carefully and momentarily, the self's usual boundary. It let something in or let something out. Drinking wine in the god's honor was a form of communion, a participation in his nature, brief and controlled, and immensely old, available to anyone who lifted the cup. This was why wine, when given ceremonially, was mixed with water, not to dilute it, but to proportion it, to bring it into the range of what a mortal body could receive without being overcome, the way the god himself had had to be approached in measured form, in increments, in the proportioned light of myth and ritual, rather than in the full blaze of the divine. The Roman Senate, in the year 186 before the Common Era, issued a decree against Bacchic worship throughout Roman Italy. The document is called the Senatus Consultum de Bacchanalibus, and it is one of the most carefully documented episodes of religious suppression in the ancient world. It survives not only in Livy's account in his History of Rome, but in the actual physical object of the decree, a bronze tablet found at Tiriolo in Calabria in the year 1640 of the Common Era, the Latin letters still readable on green patinated metal, the Senate's language preserved in inscription for a span of time so long it is difficult to hold in the mind. The tablet was lifted out of a field. The letters were legible. The fear was still there, inscribed in the metal, waiting. The Senate's concern, as Livy records it, was that the Bacchic rites had expanded beyond their original scope, had grown in number and in secrecy, had attracted men as well as women, which was unusual. The rites had traditionally been predominantly female and had become, in the Senate's view, a site of criminal and political conspiracy under the cover of religious observance. Whether those specific claims were accurate is a question historians have discussed at length without arriving at a settled answer. What is clear is that the Senate found the rites alarming enough to act against them with unusual decisiveness, issuing a decree that restricted where and under what conditions they could be performed, how many people could attend, who was permitted to preside, and what could be done at them. The decree did not abolish Bacchic worship. It regulated it, brought it back inside the boundaries of what civic authority could see and count and oversee. The god had been here before. The shape of the Senate's concern, when set beside the myths of Pentheus, the daughters of Minyas, the Argive resistance to the cult's arrival, the pattern is consistent across centuries and cultures and political systems. An authority encounters the god's influence spreading outside the lines it can manage and tries to draw those lines more tightly around it. The authority generally succeeds. In the short term, the rite continues in some reduced or regulated form inside the new boundary. And then, years or decades or centuries later, the next episode of the same pattern begins, and the god is again present in places the authorities would prefer he was not. The bronze tablet in its field in Calabria, those 18 centuries of Latin letters waiting to be read, makes that persistence visible in a specific and concrete way. The Senate's decree was meant to solve a problem. It was preserved by chance and by burial and by the specific chemistry of bronze and soil until a time when the problem it addressed had passed so completely out of living memory that the tablet became an artifact of scholarship rather than of governance. But the god it was written to contain had outlasted the Senate, outlasted the empire whose Senate issued the decree, outlasted the entire civic structure within which the decree made sense. The vine continued to grow. Euripides gave Pentheus one of the oldest theaters in the world, and the Baccha, the play in which the king of Thebes meets the god he refused, was itself performed in a theater dedicated to that god, on a hillside of a city that built its democracy alongside its Dionysiac festivals, that understood tragedy and comedy as religious acts and the mask as a sacred object. The theater of Dionysus at Athens was not a venue that happened to host religious plays. It was a temple that happened to be designed for performance. The stone seats descending toward the circular orchestra, the altar at the center of that circle, the altar to Dionysus standing in the precinct nearby, these were not separate things, but parts of a single sacred arrangement, the city's formal acknowledgement that the god belonged to public life. The Athenians who watched Pentheus descend into madness, and the Maenads tear through the mountain, and Agave return to the city, carrying what she believed was a lion's head, were watching, in the specific technical sense of their tradition, a ritual act performed in the god's presence. The masks the actors wore were sacred objects. The chorus turning in the orchestra below was performing a version of the same movement that Maenad ritual required on the mountain. The distance between the theater and the wild hillside was not as great as the city walls suggested. The theater was, in some sense, a way of containing the mountain inside the city, of bringing the god's energy into a form that civic life could witness and survive. That is one reading of what tragedy was for, and the god whose name it was performed in gave it its particular charge. The word that ancient sources most consistently associated with Dionysus's theatrical legacy is catharsis, a term Aristotle used in a single passage of the Poetics to describe what tragedy produced in its audience, a word that scholars have argued about for 24 centuries without exhausting. What Aristotle meant by it is genuinely uncertain. What the experience of the theater and the god's festival might have offered the audience who sat in those cold stone seats is something that can be described but not closed. A passage through something, through grief, through recognition, through the sight of a man like themselves being destroyed by a power he refused to acknowledge, and an emergence on the other side of that passage, still themselves, still alive, still seated in the city, the sky above the theater, the same sky it had been at the beginning. The god was present in all of it. He was present in the wine mixed in the crater at the festival's first evening. He was present in the procession through the city carrying his image. He was present in the masks the actors took up and put on and removed. He was present in the ivy growing over the temple steps in the winter months when Apollo was away, and the sanctuary at Delphi belonged to him, the oracle silent, the site inhabited by a different kind of divine attention. Presence was his particular mode. Wherever he was acknowledged, he arrived. Wherever he was refused, the refusal eventually broke, not always with violence, not always with speed, but with the patient inevitability of something that has been arriving since before the cities existed. There is a vine that grows against a stone wall somewhere in the Mediterranean. The wall is old, older than the people who last recorded the name of whoever built it. The vine is older than the wall. Its trunk is thick at the base, gnarled and dark, with the specific darkness of wood that has been alive long enough to have its own grain, its own history of seasons. The roots go down into dry soil, rocky soil, the kind that seems like it should not sustain anything, the kind that the vine has had a long time to learn how to work with. Through the cold months, the vine is bare. The wood is visible, the structure of the plant without any obscuring greenery, the way it has climbed and spread across the stone made legible by the winter light. Then the warmth begins to return. It begins as a suggestion rather than a fact. The air a little less sharp at midday, the ground a little softer at the surface, the quality of the light changing in some way that is difficult to name but easy to feel. And the vine responds to it. At the tips of each branch, in the exact places where the wood is youngest and most recently grown, something pushes out, something small and green, and so finely made that it is almost translucent in the early light. The new growth of a vine in the first days of spring, reaching outward from the branch tip into the warmer air as though it has been waiting all winter for precisely this moment, which, in the way that plants work, it has, the wine that comes from this vine's fruit, and the wine that comes from the fruit of every other vine growing in every other stony soil across the length of the Mediterranean, the wine that filled the Greek craters, that was carried on trading ships from one harbor to another, that was poured out as offering before the god's altar, and mixed with water in the large clay vessels at festivals and symposia and ordinary evening meals. That wine is still made, still poured, still drunk by people who know the god's name and by people who do not. The grape does not require the worshiper to remember where it came from. The vine does not stop growing because the tradition that explained its origin has changed its form. What the myth was trying to say about fermentation and transformation and the thin, permeable boundary between the self and something larger than the self. That understanding persists in the grape, in the fermentation, in the specific way that wine, carefully proportioned, still does what the tradition always said it did. The myths of Dionysus, the double birth, the wandering, the resistance, and the punishment, and the strange and generous gifts were told for as long as the tradition that produced them remained alive, and then they were written down, and then they were read by people who no longer worshiped the god, but found in the stories something that seemed worth preserving, and then they were read by others who found in the same stories something that seemed worth studying, and the chain of reading and transmission and scholarly argument and artistic retelling has not yet stopped. Euripides' Bacchae was performed in Athens around 405 years before the Common Era. It was performed in the 20th century of the Common Era, in languages that Euripides had never heard, in cities that did not exist when he wrote the play, by companies whose existence would have been incomprehensible to him. The play is still performed. The god is still present in it, as much as he is ever present anywhere. The theater of Dionysus on the slope of the Athenian Acropolis will still be cold before sunrise tomorrow. The stone seats will have dew on them. The circular orchestra floor will be in shadow for a little while. Yet, the sky at the eastern edge beginning, very slowly, to show the light that comes before the sun. The city below will begin its sounds, wheels, water, voices starting up. The theater will be quiet for a little while longer than the city will, the way that sacred spaces are often quieter than the spaces around them, holding their particular kind of silence a little longer into the morning. The vine against the stone wall is still doing what it has always done,